Hello and welcome to my channel, and welcome to this week's Wednesday Interlude, in which I discuss my reading progress of the books that I have been reading since the previous Wednesday. Be sure to continue watching to find out what I think of the first book in the Raj Quartet, The Jewel in the Crown by Paul Scott, and to hear an extract. Since last Wednesday I have read several stories in Star Trek The Classic Episodes Volume 1, adapted by James Blish. I read one story every morning over 1 or 2 days. There are 3 volumes in all. I found these books quite by accident, or should I say it was a serendipity moment, which is one of my favourite words. I was living in Eastbourne at the time. Eastbourne is a favourite retirement seaside resort on the south coast of England because it's a sun trap and gets a high level of sunshine in the summer months. I wasn't exactly retired at the time, but I was living there for a year or so while my first wife, who was living in North London, and I worked out some issues between us. Anyway, I was at a loose end and drifted into a little independent bookshop to while away the time when I spotted the 3 fat paperbacks of the Star Trek series. Having seen and loved the TV series in the late 60s and early 70s, I couldn't resist picking up these 3 books. They were the 25th anniversary editions, but my copies were published in 1994, which may have been around the time I acquired them. Volume 1 has 27 stories. Volume 2 has 25 stories, and Volume 3 has 24 stories. "76 stories in all. While I am not really a science fiction fan in general, I really enjoy these stories, mainly for the characters of Jim, Spock, McCoy, Scotty, Sulu, Uhura, and others. The interplay of the characters was the highlight of the TV series and is continued in the adaptations by James Blish, who has done a superb job in bringing these stories to the page. Have you noticed that whenever the main characters beam down to a hostile environment, they inevitably take 1 or 2 expendables with them? If there's any trouble, they are usually the first ones to be killed. After all, Jim, Spock, and McCoy have to return for the following week's exciting episode. In the afternoon, I'm reading Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, Steve's mandatory book for his read-along. I interpret that to mean that it is mandatory, providing I want to read it. But don't tell Steve. I had no problem, though, in reading Pride and Prejudice, Jane's brilliant novel. We are at the 3rd quarter of 15 chapters. In this section is the magnificently inept proposal that Darcy makes to Elizabeth. His disbelief when she turns him down is a joy to behold. This leads to Darcy's superb letter to Elizabeth, a closely reasoned argument in masterly prose. This is the pivotal moment in the novel and leads to a change of attitude in Elizabeth. Here she is in conversation with Jane, in which she discusses the letter and Austen extracts the maximum amount of humour from the situation. Excuse me. She, Elizabeth, then spoke of the letter, repeating the whole of the contents as far as they concerned George Wickham. What a stroke was this for poor Jane, who would willingly have gone through the world without believing that so much wickedness existed in the whole race of mankind, as was here collected in one individual. Nor was Darcy's vindication, though grateful to her feelings, capable of consoling her for such discovery. Most earnestly did she labour to prove the probability of error, and seek to clear one without involving the other. This will not do, said Elizabeth. You never will be able to make both of them good for anything. Take your choice, but you must be satisfied with only one. There is but a quantity of merit between them, just enough to make one good sort of man, and of late it has been shifting about pretty much. For my part, I'm inclined to believe it all Mr. Darcy's, but you shall do as you choose. It was some time, however, before a smile could be extorted from Jane. I do not know when I've been more shocked, said she. Wickham so very bad? It is almost past belief. And poor Mr. Darcy, dear Lizzie, consider what he must have suffered. Such a disappointment, and with the knowledge of your ill opinion too. And having to relate such a thing of his sister, it really is too distressing. I'm sure you feel it so. Poor Wickham, there is such an expression of goodness in his manner. There certainly was some great mismanagement in the education of those two young men, said Elizabeth. One has got all the goodness, and the other all the appearance of it. Thus we are given to understand that Elizabeth has come to understand the true natures of both Mr. Darcy and Mr. Wickham. For the March Mystery Madness Challenge, I chose an Inspector Morse novel, The Remorseful Day by Colin Dexter. I didn't realise at the time that it was the last book in the series. Thank you to Sue for pointing that out. But as it was the first one in the only omnibus I had, and as it was a really superbly written story, I had to continue reading it as I am thoroughly enjoying Dexter's characterisation of Morse. So much so that in a moment of madness I immediately ordered the 4 omnibus volumes of his Inspector Morse novels, and you can see them in the thumbnail. I'm planning to read them in order of publication of the individual novels, and of course I will reread The Remorseful Day at the end. Speaking of rereading, there is a readathon challenge for 2019. And as I plan to reread some of my favourite books in 2019 anyway, I decided to participate, although I'm ignoring all the prompts. And so I'm rereading Mr. Ingleside by E.V. Lucas. I'm not sure where or when I acquired this book. I remember that I once owned the 2-volume biography of Charles Lamb by E.V. Lucas, so when I saw Mr. Ingleside in a second-hand bookshop, I bought it. I lost the biography of Charles Lamb in indeed my lifetime's collection when I emigrated to South Africa and took them with me, and then had to return to the UK without them. I've since restocked my library, as you can partly see behind me. Mr. Ingleside is a book of episodes about Mr. Ingleside and his daughter Anne. When the book opens, Mrs. Ingleside and his oldest daughter Alison have emigrated to Japan. Anne is away at school, and Mr. Ingleside decides to take her out of school and to have her as a companion. Some of the episodes revolve around trying to find a suitable occupation for Anne to follow, just so she'll have something to occupy her time. Later, Mrs. Ingleside dies, and Alison returns to England, and so there are episodes involving her as well. The book is charming, witty, and enjoyable. In the evening, I'm reading the first 2 books of the Raj Quartet by Paul Scott. A total of 935 pages for March of the Mammoths, co-hosted by Alex of Big Al Books. There could not be more of a contrast with the first 4 books I've mentioned. They are light, breezy, easy, and delightful. The Jewel in the Crown, the first book in the Raj Quartet, is characterised by convoluted and inverted sentence structure, tricky plotting, and monologue-style writing, which means that I cannot manage more than about 20 pages in a session. This is a challenging and dense work because the plotting is layered. By this I mean that the story is told from multiple viewpoints and backtracks, and the approach taken by Scott is to tell the story through monologues, first by one character and then another. Any conversations are reported as having taken place in the past rather than actually taking place in the present. This makes the prose very challenging. My hope is that reading through this challenging work will prove to be a rewarding and worthwhile endeavour at the end. I was discussing this with Alex at Big Al Books. Should we bail a la Sean or persevere a la Steve? But this is a topic for a Sunday morning meetup. Here is an example of Scott's writing, from page 112 of course. Sister Ludmilla handed over her cheque made out to cash. Week by week she came to Mr. Govindas for 200 rupees. The cheques were drawn upon the Imperial Bank of India in Bombay. The Imperial Bank has long since become the State Bank, and Mr. Govindas long since retired. His memory remains sharp, however. Since she never paid money in, and was known by Mr. Govindas to pay all her trade accounts by cheque as well, he could only assume that either her fortune was large or her account credited regularly from elsewhere. The long-standing instruction from the Bombay branch authorising the cashing facilities at Mayapur described her as Mrs. Ludmilla Smith, and the cheques were signed accordingly. By pumping a friend in Bombay, Mr. Govindas eventually discovered that the money came from the treasury of a small princely state and might be reckoned as some sort of pension, because Mrs. Ludmilla Smith's husband, said to be an engineer, had died while on the ruler's payroll. She took the 200 rupees as follows: 50 rupees in notes of 5 rupees denomination, 100 rupees in notes of 1 rupee, and 50 rupees in small change. Mr. Govindas estimated that most of the small change and a fair proportion of the 1 rupee notes were distributed to the poor, and that the rest went on wages for her assistants and casual purchases in the market. He knew that her meat, grain and vegetables were supplied on monthly account by local contractors, and that medicines were bought from Dr. Gulab Singh Sahib's pharmacy at a trade discount of 12.5% plus 5% for monthly settlement. He knew that Sister Ludmilla drank only 1 glass of orange juice a day and ate 1 meal of rice and pulses in the evening, with curds to follow, except on Fridays when she has a modest curry with vegetables, and on Christian festivals, fish. The rest of the food was consumed by her assistants and in meals for the hungry. He knew many such things about her. He sometimes thought that if he were to write down all the things he knew or heard, he would fill up several pages of the bank's foolscap. But knowing all this, he still believed that he knew nothing of importance. In this belief, in Mayapur in 1942, Mr. Govindas was not alone. This extract is typical of how Scott has one character reflect on another, and the whole book is layered like this, which makes for slow and careful reading, which is why I will not be completing it during March, but will continue with it into April and beyond, and into infinity if necessary. So that's all, folks, and remember to comment, subscribe, like and share, and I'll be back soon with another BookTube video.